he'd spent his whole life among horses and dust, never a father, never expecting to be. But one stormy night, a poker game dealt him a girl with no name, a scar like a brand, and eyes that had seen hell. After that, the wind in Dry Willow began whispering things no one dared speak. Roy Calder didn't believe in ghosts, but that didn't stop them from showing up anyway. They came in quiet ways, through the smell of sagebrush after rain, through the creak of an old saddle on a still night, through the echo of a voice that hadn't touched his name in over a decade. They weren't dressed in white. They didn't rattle chains. They just lived in the empty corners of his home and sat across the table in the form of a coffee cup that never got used. He was 48 and already fading, not from sickness, not from bullets, just from years of quiet. 12 years ago, Margaret left. Not with screaming, not with shattered dishes or slammed doors. She packed in silence, the way women do when they've been leaving in their minds for a long time. She took her Bible, the yellow pot with the rosemary plant, and her wedding ring, which she'd stopped wearing 2 winters before. Her note said only this: "I need a life with laughter, Roy. You only ever gave me land." He hadn't answered. There wasn't anything worth saying after that. He was infertile. The doctor in El Paso called it an unexplained failure to propagate. Sounded more like farming than medicine. Roy remembered standing outside that office, with the heat pressing down on him and the wind refusing to move. It was the first time he felt small, in a world he thought he understood. Since then, the ranch had gotten quieter. He'd sold off half the cattle. The barn leaned a little harder in the wind every year. The old paint on the front porch peeled back like skin, and Roy just let it. He had no heirs, just horses and dogs and the kind of days that slid by without asking much of a man. Dry Willow sat 3 miles east, small enough to forget, but just big enough to whisper. Folks didn't bother Roy anymore. They respected silence even if they didn't understand it. They figured he was just one of those ranchers who got left behind by time. And maybe he was. That night, the wind carried the smell of wet earth. Rain had finally come after weeks of dust, tapping soft on the barn roof like an old friend too polite to knock loud. Roy stood inside, the lantern low, staring at the wooden beam that stretched across the ceiling like a bone too stubborn to break. He had a rope in his hand, thick, worn. It had held a wild Mustang once, held it through storms and bucking fits. It was strong enough. He wasn't drunk, wasn't even sad. He was just finished. He looped the rope, tied the knot the way his father taught him when he was 12. Took one last look at the stall where the mare had given birth last spring. Thought about how her foal died 10 minutes later. Cord twisted, too much blood. He'd buried it without naming it, like everything else. He stepped onto the old crate. The wood groaned beneath his boots. The lantern flickered, then 3 sharp knocks outside the barn door. He froze. Not thunder, not wind, knuckles. Real. He stepped down, heart thudding now, not from fear, but from confusion. No one came out here this late, not without needing something bad. He opened the door. There stood Mick Donner, an old friend from the cattle days, a man whose beard grew faster than his debts, soaked to the bone, grinning like a coyote that just found a chicken coop. "Still got that lucky hand, Roy?" Mick asked, holding up a battered deck of cards inside a waxed cloth. "'Cause there's a game in town tonight. High stakes, low morals." Roy just stared. Mick leaned in. "Come on. What the hell else you doing out here? Talking to horses?" Roy looked past him, into the dark, into the storm, into the life he'd almost walked out of. And just like that, the ghost of a noose slipped out of his hand. Let me know when you're ready to continue with Chapter 2. Van by qua quai. He didn't lose, he was chosen to win. Or you may paste the next Donnie chapter to expand. Ban Janoi. Tiep tuk chat GPT Janoi. Chapter 2, The Devil's Hand. They rode into Dry Willow with rain clinging to their coats like guilt. Mick Donner talked the whole way, about cards, about the money, about the new strangers in town who played for keeps but didn't know how to count tells. He called it a sure thing, a divine hand waiting for a divine fool to claim it. Roy didn't say much. The town had changed. Or maybe it just looked smaller after all these years. Same crooked saloon sign, same muddy street that never dried right. The windows of Reedy's Tavern glowed yellow through the downpour, laughter leaking through the walls like heat. Inside, the room was thick with smoke and bad decisions. 4 men sat around the back table. One was Reedy himself, owner, dealer, drink pusher. The others Roy didn't recognize. A miner with dirty fingernails, a lean kid with twitchy eyes, and then the last one, Clay Morrow. He wore black, not like a preacher, not like a gunman, like someone who wanted to be both. He had silver rings on 3 fingers and a scar across his throat that peeked out from under his collar, a voice like velvet soaked in whiskey. "New blood," Clay said, smiling at Roy like he already knew everything about him. Mick slapped Roy's shoulder. "Told you he'd come. Fellas got instincts." Reedy shuffled the deck without a word. Roy sat, not because he wanted to win, not even because he needed the money, but because something about Clay Morrow made his stomach tighten, like staring at a wolf in Sunday clothes. The game moved slow. Whiskey poured, cards passed. Roy's hands stayed steady, his face unreadable. Across from him, Clay talked soft, about the world, about second chances, about debts not always being about money. "You ever believe in fate, Roy?" he asked, voice low and smooth. Roy didn't answer. Clay leaned back. "Some folks don't lose, not 'cause they're lucky, but because the devil's got his thumb on the scale." Then came the final hand. Reedy dealt with slow precision. Clay didn't even look at his cards at first. He just watched Roy, like a man watching a match flicker before it hits the fuse. "I'm all in," Clay said, sliding a heavy coin purse forward. Reedy frowned. "That's short." Clay smiled. "I'll cover it." He snapped his fingers, and from the back room a shape emerged. Small, barefoot, a girl. She was wrapped in a threadbare cloak, head covered, hands bound in front. Could have been 16, could have been younger, mud on her calves, hair stringy and wet. She didn't speak, didn't even lift her face. Clay reached out and tugged the scarf from her head. Roy's blood turned to gravel, a scar on her wrist. Circular, faint but not faint enough. "She don't talk much," Clay said casually, "but she listens real well." Reedy started to protest, but Clay raised one hand. "You said high stakes." Roy's breath caught in his throat. "You're betting a girl." "Not just a girl," Clay said, smiling too easily. "A mystery. You win, she's yours, safe, out of harm's way. And if I lose, then you get to keep your silence, cowboy, and we both go home with ghosts." It was wrong. It was madness. But Roy stayed in, not for the girl, but for the damn feeling in his gut that this wasn't about cards, that it never was. The others folded one by one, until it was just Roy and Clay. Roy laid down 3 queens, clean, straight. Clay paused, looked at his cards, then smiled, and folded. No protest, no bluff, just a nod. "She's yours," Clay said. "Treat her better than her last owner." He stood, tipped his hat, and walked out into the rain. The girl didn't move. She just stared at the table, not crying, not blinking. Reedy whispered, "What the hell just happened?" Roy didn't answer. He took off his coat, walked over, and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched but didn't pull away. Then he led her out of that saloon, into the storm, into the wind, into whatever the hell this was. And in the shadows behind them, the man in gray watched it all without saying a word. The road home was long and muddy. Roy didn't speak. The girl didn't either. She walked beside the horse, not on it. Wouldn't let him lift her up. wouldn't even look him in the eye, barefoot still, soaked, shoulders tight like a hound that had been kicked too many times to flinch anymore. The coat hung off her like it didn't belong. Maybe it didn't. When they got back to the ranch, Roy brought her into the barn first, not the house. Something told him walls would press too close. He rolled out an old wool blanket in the hayloft, gave her a tin cup of water, and lit the lantern low. Not too bright. She didn't blink much in the dark. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just sat with her back to the post, arms around her knees, as still as furniture. He left her there, closed the barn door slow, bolted it from the inside, not to keep her in, but to keep whatever she came from out. He slept on the porch with a rifle beside him, and Boone curled at his feet. The wind kicked dust into the corners of his eyes, but he didn't move. He didn't dream either. Come morning, she was gone. Not far, just down by the fence line, standing barefoot in the frost with her hand on the old post, like she was waiting for it to open. Boone was watching her from 10 feet off, tail twitching but not barking. Roy stepped up slow. "You cold?" She didn't answer. "You hungry?" No reply. "You got a name?" She turned her head just slightly, eyes sunken but sharp, and for a breath he swore she was about to speak. But she didn't. He noticed the mark then, on her wrist, a scar, smooth, circular, almost perfect, not from a cut, not an accident, a brand. Roy looked away. He didn't ask more. Instead, he made her breakfast, eggs, toast, black coffee, set the plate on the porch railing, and walked back inside. Watched from the window. She waited a long while before creeping up like a stray, ate with her fingers, drank straight from the mug, didn't waste a thing. When she was done, she washed the plate without being told, then sat back on the porch and picked at the hem of the coat, like it might unravel into something that made sense. Roy sat across from her that evening. No talking, just the sound of coyotes howling out past the ridge and the creak of the windmill in the dark. "You ever hear music?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. She glanced up. He pulled a harmonica from his coat pocket, old, dented, barely tuned, played a few notes, soft, not a melody, just a sound to fill the space. Her shoulders stiffened. "You know that tune?" She said nothing, but her hand clenched, fingers digging into her knee. He stopped playing. She stood, walked back to the barn, didn't look back. That night, while Roy sat sharpening his knife by the stove, he heard something, the soft scrape of a brush. He stepped outside and saw her in the barn, brushing down the mare. Slow, careful, like she'd done it 1,000 times, like muscle memory knew what the mind didn't. She hadn't asked. She just did it. Roy watched a while, then turned back in. At dawn, he found the porch swept, a bowl washed, his saddle blanket folded, still no name, still no words. But something had changed. This girl, they hadn't broken her. They'd tried, but something in her still stood. And Roy knew, whoever she was, she hadn't been lost in a poker game. She'd been delivered. The fog rolled in before dawn, thick as wool and just as heavy. It crept through the trees and across the pasture, swallowing the fence posts one by one until the whole ranch looked like it had been erased from the earth. Roy hadn't seen it come in this dense in years, not since the flood season, back when the river still had something to say. He stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the mist move like it knew where it was going. Boone growled low, pacing along the rail. That was the first sign. Inside the barn, Lena was already awake. She hadn't taken to sleeping through the night. Roy wasn't sure she ever really slept. He'd heard her pacing at odd hours, heard the creak of the ladder to the loft, the whisper of hay being moved around just enough to stay sane. That morning she didn't look tired. She looked alert, like something had shifted, like something was coming. Roy checked the gates, walked the fence line, everything in place, until he got to the far post, the one near the cottonwoods. There, in the mud beneath it, a trap, a small rusted steel trap, half buried but still set. Not for coyotes, too crude, not fresh but not old either. The kind meant to hurt, not kill. He dug it out with his boot and tossed it aside. Looked around. No prints, not with the ground damp as it was. But he knew. Someone had been close enough to set it, close enough to watch. That afternoon, while hammering a loose rail back into the western corral, he heard the voice of Tommy Ray behind him, barefoot as usual and grinning like he was carrying a secret too big for his little chest. "Mr. Roy," the boy said, "I saw somebody." Roy looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Where?" "Behind the creek bend, just standin'. Tall fella, gray coat, didn't move none." Roy squinted. "You sure?" Tommy nodded fast. "I thought he was a tree, but he turned, saw me, then just stepped backward and disappeared." Roy's gut turned cold. "Tell your mama?" Tommy looked down. "She don't listen when she's got the gin." Roy handed him a biscuit from the saddlebag. "Next time you see something, you don't go near it. You come straight here, understand?" The boy nodded, already chewing. That evening Roy doubled the locks, reinforced the barn door with scrap timber. He didn't explain, Lena didn't ask, but she watched him closely. "Was it him?" she asked softly as he bolted the door. Roy met her eyes. "I don't know, could be one of them." She said nothing more, just turned, climbed the ladder to the loft, and disappeared into the shadows. Later, Roy walked the perimeter with Boone. The dog stopped halfway around, hackles raised, ears pinned back. Staring into the fog, Roy raised his rifle. Nothing, but the quiet. It was too quiet. No crickets, no owls. Even the wind had stopped breathing. He didn't sleep that night, sat on the porch again, gun across his knees, a cup of coffee gone cold by his elbow. In the middle of the night, the windmill groaned once, then again. A long-drawn creak, like something was leaning on it. Roy stood. He didn't call out, didn't go investigate, he just waited. Waited for the knock that might come. Waited for the past that always knew how to find its way home. And somewhere in the barn, above him, Lena whispered the first word she'd spoken in hours. "They're close." And Roy believed her. Dry Willow hadn't changed much. A church with more dust than sermons, a saloon with more lies than whiskey, and a general store run by a woman too stubborn to die and too sharp to be fooled. Roy rode in just after noon, dust trailing behind him like old memories he hadn't finished burying. Boone trotted close at his side, ears forward, nose twitching. The dog had been uneasy for days, same as Roy. He hitched the horse outside Boone's Mercantile, the only place in town where the truth didn't come sugar-coated. Inside, Miss Thalia Boone was restocking bullets and tobacco, her apron stained with flour and dried herbs. She didn't smile when Roy stepped through the door, just looked up and said, "Something's following you, Calder. I can smell it." Roy tipped his hat. "Thought it might just be the dog." Thalia didn't laugh. "What do you need?" "Information," he said, low. "And maybe a favor." She squinted at him. "You bring that girl with you?" "No," Roy said. "She's at the ranch." "Good. This town ain't ready for whatever's stitched into her skin." Roy stepped closer to the counter, dropped a coin. "You ever hear the name Jude Harlan?" That got her attention. She stopped moving, her jaw clenched just slightly. "You best hope you ain't crossed his path." "Too late." Thalia stared at him hard. "He's not a man you look at twice. Quiet type. Wears gray even when the sun's cookin'. Carries a Bible he never opens and a knife he don't clean." Roy nodded. "Sounds like him. He passed through here once, maybe 3 years back. Asked about supplies, asked if I sold chloroform. She paused. And if I knew how to bind silence. Roy's stomach turned. Did he say where he came from? He didn't have to. She slid a yellowed envelope across the counter. He left this, told me to give it to someone with blood on their hands but not yet on their soul. I figured that meant you. Roy opened the envelope. Inside, a photograph. Old, faded, 2 girls. One of them was Lena, the other was older, blonde, smiling. On the back, in tight black ink, hope will lead her back to us. The circle is not yet closed. Roy folded it slow, the muscles in his jaw tight. He left anything else? He asked. Thalia hesitated, then reached beneath the counter and placed a small wooden carving on the counter, a circle with an eye carved inside it, the same symbol branded into Lena's wrist. Showed up on my doorstep a week ago, she said. Didn't hear no horse, didn't hear a step, just opened the door and there it was. Roy picked it up, thumb running along the grain. It was smooth, freshly carved. They're coming, he muttered. No, Thalia said. They're already here. Just then, the bell above the door rang. Roy turned. A man stepped in, tall, thin, clean coat the color of funeral ash. No hat, no smile, no sound. Jude Harlan. Thalia stepped back without a word. Roy's hand didn't go for the gun. Not yet. Jude looked at him. Eyes like dry bone. Calm, empty. She still breathing? He asked, voice smooth as a hymn. Roy didn't answer. That's good, Jude said. We were worried the delivery might not take. She's not yours, Roy said. Jude smiled faintly. She never was, but she was meant. Roy's voice dropped to gravel. What do you want? The same thing we've always wanted, Jude replied. Return, obedience, purity. Roy stepped forward. She has a name, a mind, a choice. Jude's eyes darkened. She has blood, Calder, and blood is prophecy. Before Roy could draw, Jude stepped back out the door. Gone, no horse, no sound, just dust curling in the air like breath too cold to stay. Roy stood frozen a moment, then looked to Thalia. You said favor, she whispered. I need to know where they came from, where they're gathering. Thalia gave a slow nod. You don't need bullets for this, Roy, she said. You need fire. Roy turned to the door. Then I'll bring both. The wind had changed again. No longer cold, no longer dry. It carried a sweetness now, cloying and thick, like wildflowers growing in the wrong season. Roy didn't trust it. Nothing sweet came easy in this part of the world. When he got back to the ranch, Lena was sitting cross-legged in the dirt outside the barn. Her hands were black with soot, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She'd drawn something in the earth, a series of circles overlapping like ripples in a still pond. She didn't look up when he rode in. Roy dismounted slow, Boone jumping down ahead of him. Wasn't expecting company, he said. Lena replied without turning. I wasn't drawing. Roy stepped closer. Then what were you doing? Remembering. Her voice had that faraway quality again, like it had to climb through too many locked doors just to come out. I saw him, Roy said. Jude. That made her glance up. Her eyes were unreadable. He left this. He pulled the photo from his coat pocket and handed it to her. She took it, turned it over. Her fingers shook just a little. That's her, she whispered. Roy nodded. Hope. Lena pressed the photo to her chest. They told me she was gone, that she had moved on, but they never said dead. They just kept saying she'd fulfilled her purpose. Roy crouched beside her. Do you remember the place? Lena closed her eyes. It had no windows, just light that came from the ceiling, too white, too quiet. We had to ask permission to speak, even to move. Roy said nothing. They gave us numbers, not names. But Hope, she called me Bird. Said I had wings tucked somewhere in me. Said I'd fly first. She pulled back her sleeve, then, slow, held out her left wrist. You've seen the scar, she said, but you didn't see the rest. On the inside of her forearm, barely visible under the grime and soot, was a series of tiny notches, rows, sharp, precise. Roy frowned. What are those? Days, Lena said. Not since I arrived, since I stopped speaking. Roy felt something tighten in his chest. They told me I was chosen, she said, that my silence proved I had accepted the order. But I didn't accept anything, I just broke. Quiet was safer than screaming. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a charcoal nub. Then, with a shaky hand, she began to draw on the barn wall. Quick, crude strokes. A room, a single bed, a mirror on the ceiling, a locked door without a handle on the inside. And next to the door, a woman, tall, blonde, holding a book. She read to me at night, Lena said, only when they weren't watching. She said it was from a Bible, but it sounded different, softer, less cruel. She was trying to keep you human, Roy said. Lena nodded. She told me one day I'd hear a sound that didn't come from them, that I'd know it when it came. Roy leaned forward. What sound? A harmonica. Her voice barely cracked above a whisper. That night you played it, she said. It came back to me, too. Roy stared at her, the truth settling like dust in his lungs. She escaped, he said slowly. Hope got out, somehow. Lena looked up at him, and I think she left a trail. That night, Roy brought out an old trunk from under the floorboards. Inside, maps, journals, old military dispatches from his time riding under Fort Apache command. Names, routes, hidden outposts. They laid them out under the oil lamp, side by side, matching symbols Lena remembered with coded marks Roy once ignored. There was overlap, too much to be coincidence. One name appeared again and again, Wellspring, not just a place, not just a name, a system, a sickness dressed up in salvation. Roy stood back from the table, hands on his hips. You ready to leave this place behind? He asked. Lena looked at the maps. No, she said, but I'm ready to find what they buried. Roy nodded. Then he reached into the bottom of the trunk and pulled out a faded photograph, his own wife, smiling, holding a small pair of boots she never got to use. She wanted a girl, he said. Lena didn't speak, just reached out and touched the corner of the photo with 2 fingers. They didn't say goodnight, just folded the maps, packed supplies. The sun would rise soon, and this time they wouldn't be waiting for the past to find them. They were going to dig it up. Roy didn't wake so much as rise. Sleep had become a formality since the night Lena came through the gate. His ribs ached from an old break, the kind that never healed right, the kind that reminded you just how mortal you really were. He winced as he swung his legs down from the cot, then listened. The house was quiet, but not empty. He could feel her in the next room. Lena had taken to the corner of the parlor, sleeping upright with her back against the wall, eyes half shut but always listening. She didn't ask for a bed. She didn't want one. Roy made coffee, black, strong, burned just enough to taste like memory. Outside, the sky was a bruise-colored gray, no wind, just the heavy quiet of something waiting. He brought her a mug, set it beside her without a word. She opened her eyes, took it, sipped. No thanks, none needed. After breakfast, Roy went out to check the barn. The horses were restless. Even Boone paced near the door, hackles half up. Lena stayed behind, said she wanted to sort the maps again, said she needed to line things up. An hour later, Roy came back in, boots heavy with mud. He found her sitting at the table, one of the dispatch maps open in front of her. Her fingers traced along a trail line again and again, not reading it, feeling it. You good? He asked. She didn't answer. He stepped closer. That's when he saw it. A single tear running down her cheek, not sudden, not dramatic, just quiet, uninvited. "Lena," he said softer. She shook her head, eyes still locked on the paper. "She used to trace things too," she whispered. "Hope. She'd draw paths that weren't on the maps. Said they were emotional routes, that people leave behind trails in pain, not in miles." Roy sat across from her. "I remembered her voice last night," she said. "Not the words, just the tone. She had this way of talking soft when everything else was loud, like she could wrap your panic in a whisper." Roy didn't speak, just waited. "I watched her die," Lena said. That made him flinch. She fought. She grabbed one of their needles, stabbed it into the preacher's eye, screamed my name as they dragged her out. I didn't move. I just sat there. I didn't even cry. Her hand trembled now. That was the last sound I heard for months. And then, like a dam cracking under silence, she wept. Not loud, not messy, but the kind of crying that came from a place buried so deep it had to claw its way up through bone. Roy didn't reach out, didn't offer a hand. He just sat there. After a while, she wiped her face with her sleeve. "I thought if I held it in long enough, it would stay buried." "It doesn't," Roy said. "Not if it matters." She looked at him, eyes red, voice dry. "Did you ever cry over her?" Roy stiffened. "Margaret? No, the one you never got." He looked away. "I named her in my head," he said. "Used to sit on the porch and picture her riding beside me, braids bouncing, dust on her face, wild as the land." "What did you call her?" "June." Lena smiled, just a flicker. "That's a good name." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything finally allowed to settle between them without needing to be carried. Later that afternoon, Roy found her in the barn, brushing down the mare. She was humming. Soft, off-key, the same tune he used to play on his harmonica. He watched from the doorway, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, maybe, or something like it. She wasn't healed. Hell, she wasn't even whole, but she was alive. And for the first time since that cursed poker game, Roy felt like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the story of a girl who lost everything. It was the story of a girl who survived it, and a man who didn't save her, but stayed anyway. The sun came up behind a curtain of dust that day, streaking the land in gold and grit. Roy stood on the ridge behind the ranch, holding a worn spyglass that used to belong to his father. Below, the valley stretched wide and silent, but his gut told him noise was coming, the kind that doesn't rattle the windows, but guts. Inside, Lena packed, not in a rush, not with fear, but like someone who knew the road would find her, whether she was ready or not. She folded the maps, wrapped a small hunting knife in cloth, and at the bottom of her bag she placed the photo of Hope, flat between two Bible pages she'd found torn and discarded behind the barn. Roy returned just before noon. His face was set hard, but his eyes were different. He poured coffee, then sat down across from her. "I saw Thalia," he said. Lena froze. "She told me things I think she's been swallowing for decades." Lena nodded once. "What did she say?" Roy took a long sip. "She said Clay wasn't always a traitor. He used to wear a collar, preacher, ran a small congregation out near Nevada, called it the Wellspring of Mercy." Lena's lips tightened. "She said they took in the broken, the unwanted, kids mostly, promised them family, food, salvation." Lena looked down. "And purpose." Roy leaned in. "They didn't raise children, they bred them." The word hung there like smoke from a house fire. She said Clay believed bloodlines were holy, that the only way to redeem man's fall was to rebuild the pure line he claimed was lost. Lena looked him in the eye. Hope was his first attempt. Roy's voice was low. And you were the second. Silence. Then Lena spoke. He used to pray over us, not the way real preachers do. His prayers were like declarations, like he was telling God what to do, not asking. Roy swallowed hard. Thalia said she saw Clay burn their chapel to the ground when the state came snooping. Said he walked into the fire carrying 2 kids and came out alone. Lena's hand gripped the edge of the table. Hope didn't burn. She bled. Roy didn't ask how she knew. He already believed her. And Jude? Lena asked. Roy nodded. Thalia said he was the last to leave. Said he took a vow to find every wayward seed Clay scattered. Called you all his sacraments. Lena stood, sudden and sharp. I'm not a sacrament, she said. I'm not a relic. I'm not a symbol. I'm just a girl who watched her sister die for believing there was something better than silence. Roy stood too. You are more than what they made you, he said. And you damn sure don't owe them your life. She looked away, blinking fast. Then why does it feel like I carry all of theirs? Roy didn't have an answer, but he handed her something wrapped in an old kerchief. A harmonica, the one she'd heard on that first night. This was Margaret's, he said. She played it when the wind howled, just to remind herself she still had breath in her. Lena unwrapped it slowly. You think I'm strong enough to face him? She asked. Roy gave a soft nod. No, but I think you're strong enough to walk through him. That night she didn't sleep. Neither did he. She sat at the table, drawing Hope's face from memory onto a scrap of parchment, and Roy, he sat outside under the stars, polishing the old Colt he'd buried the day he buried his marriage. They both knew what was coming. Not a battle, not even a reckoning, but the truth. And out there in the dark, beyond the edge of the lantern's glow, the wind shifted again. It smelled like firewood and blood. The morning didn't break. It shuddered. Skies were yellowed with heat, even though the calendar called it late spring. Birds didn't sing. The horses were skittish, snorting at shadows that hadn't moved. Roy knew something was off when Boone, usually bold as a stray bullet, refused to leave the porch. He walked to the barn with his Winchester in hand, instinct leading the way. That 6th sense men earned not through talent, but survival. The door creaked louder than usual. Inside, nothing looked touched, until he saw the nails on the far wall. They used to hold bridles. Now they were empty. Back at the house, Lena was gone. Not a note, not a sign of struggle, just her harmonica sitting on the windowsill, still warm from her hand. Roy's stomach dropped. Lena hadn't run. She remembered. Somewhere in the middle of the night, when Roy was half asleep and the wind had changed again, she saw something in her dreams. Or maybe it was a memory. A wooden post, a bell, a red door scorched black on one side. The chapel. She saw the symbol again too, burned into the back of her mind, like it had been branded there, a circle broken by a thorn. Wellspring wasn't just a name. It was a ritual site, a breeding ground for madness, and she had to go back. Alone. She rode Roy's second horse, Shadow, down the old mining trail, following the map lines she'd memorized in the firelight. The land grew silent as she neared the old canyon. By the time she reached the rim, the ground had changed, darker, softer. The scent of ash still lingered in the dirt. The chapel ruins stood where it had always stood. If one could call charred timbers and a skeleton of stone a building. She dismounted. Shadow shifted nervously behind her, but didn't bolt. Lena walked slow. Each step was a pulse of memory. Here, the place they lined up barefoot. There, the spot where Hope stood on a wooden box, eyes full of defiance. And ahead, where the altar had been. But it wasn't empty anymore. Someone had rebuilt the cross. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but with fresh wood. Sap still leaking down its grain. Tied at its base was a strip of cloth, white with a red mark. a thorn-pierced circle. Lena backed away, but not fast enough. A voice broke the stillness. "Well now, I figured you'd come back, just not so soon." She turned. Jude. His silhouette stepped out from behind the ruins, gun lowered but eyes alert. Behind him, two more figures, not boys, men, armed. "You left the ranch," Jude said. "Shame, you might have made it out clean." Lena didn't answer. "You remember this place?" he asked. "You should. It's where your sister screamed loud enough to crack the sky." Her hands clenched. "I remember what she said," Lena replied. "She said your God was just a man with fire in his mouth and rot in his hands." Jude laughed. "She was always too clever for her own salvation." He stepped closer. "You think walking away made you free. You were never a prisoner, Bird. You were a promise." Lena's voice dropped to a whisper. "I was a child." Jude didn't blink. "And now you're reborn." At that moment, a loud crack split the air. Gunfire, but it didn't come from Jude. It came from behind. The barn, the house. Roy Calder had walked into a war. Back at the ranch, fire spread fast. They'd planted charges in the hayloft. Cheap dynamite, enough to send plumes of smoke curling into the hills. Roy had been feeding the dogs when it happened. The explosion blew him 10 feet sideways, ribs slamming into the trough. He barely got up before a man, face wrapped in cloth, rushed him with a pistol. Roy pulled first. The man dropped, but it was just the beginning. Through the smoke, another came, then another. Roy fired again, missed once, then dropped the second man with a gut shot. Blood painted the barn wall. Boone barked wildly, then disappeared into the smoke, chasing the third. Roy stumbled to his feet. The porch was in flames, but the old oak cabinet, the one hidden beneath the floorboards, was still intact. He reached inside, pulled out a single object, a box of cartridges, and beside it, the map. Not the one Lena used, the one he'd kept from his military days, the one with every safe route and every hidden trail they used to hide wounded scouts during the Apache years. He grabbed it, slung the rifle over his shoulder, then staggered toward the ridge, toward Wellspring, toward the girl who never asked to be his, but had become something close. And behind him, the last of the home he built turned to ash, and somewhere in that fire, a piece of his silence finally died too. Roy rode through the smoke like a ghost reborn. The fire still clung to his coat, the heat licking at the saddle leather, but the pain was just noise now. He had one thing in mind: Lena. The trail toward Wellspring cut through canyon rock and ancient cottonwoods. He remembered every bend from the years he'd patrolled this land as a younger man, long before his bones ached and his dreams hollowed. At his side was Boone, limping but unyielding, muzzle dark with soot. In the distance, a shadow moved across the ridge. Then another. 2 riders, maybe 3. Jude's men. Roy didn't flinch. He loaded the last of his cartridges and whispered to Boone, "Stay low. If I don't make it, find her." Back at Wellspring, Lena stood at the edge of the ruined chapel, her fists clenched at her sides. Jude hadn't moved closer. He was patient, like something hunting instead of chasing. "You came back here for truth?" he asked. Truth is just a word men use when they want to feel forgiven. Lena didn't answer. She didn't need to, because behind her, from the ridge above, a rifle cracked. One of Jude's men dropped like a sack of grain, shot clean through the chest. Jude spun just as Roy crested the hill, coat scorched, eyes burning brighter than any fire he left behind. "Let her go," Roy growled. Jude sneered. "Or what, old man?" Roy raised his Winchester. "You want legacy. You'll die for it." The second man charged. Roy fired, missed. Jude grabbed Lena, pulled her close, pistol pressed to her ribs. "You shoot again," he hissed. "She bleeds." But then a rustle behind them. Out from the shadows of the broken chapel came Tommy Ray, face streaked with dust, carrying Lena's harmonica like a signal flag. He didn't speak, he just threw it. The harmonica clanged against Jude's skull. Just enough, just fast. Lena twisted free, and in that one breath, one heartbeat, Roy pulled the trigger. Boom! Jude dropped, not dead, but screaming, shot clean through the shoulder, blood soaking into the altar stone. Lena grabbed the pistol from his hand and turned it over. Not to fire, just to look at it. The same model Clay had used, nickel-plated, etched with a thorned circle. She dropped it in the dirt. Roy limped down the ridge, breath wheezing, blood in his sleeve. Tommy ran to him, helping steady his weight. "You followed me?" Roy rasped. Tommy grinned. "Mama passed out. I figured you'd need someone who don't talk much." Roy coughed a laugh. "You never shut up." They looked to Lena, who knelt beside Jude. "Tell me something," she whispered. "Was I ever anything more than a plan?" Jude blinked up at her, coughing. "You were the flame that was supposed to purify everything." She shook her head. "No, I was the match you never learned how to hold." She stood, took the map from Roy's hand. "We need to find Hope," she said. Roy nodded slowly. "But she's gone," he said. Lena looked at him, eyes full of a strength that hadn't been there just days ago. She was, but maybe she left more behind than bones. Together they rode, past the blood, past the ruins, toward a grave that had no marker, only memory, and behind them, Jude Harlan screamed alone into a sky that no longer answered. The trail to Wellspring's burial hill was no longer a road. It was a memory carved into the land. Burnt trees stood like broken crosses. The grass, yellowed and sparse, whispered under hoofbeats. Lena rode ahead, her back straight, braid whipping in the wind. Roy followed slowly behind on shadow, one arm bound with a bloodied cloth, the other gripping the reins with a strength borrowed from somewhere deep. In his saddlebag, a small wooden box. Inside it, a folded piece of cloth, a harmonica, and a worn-out map with a single red X, not for gold, not for vengeance, but for remembrance. At the top of the rise stood a crumbling stone marked only by initials, HC. The rest had been scrubbed away by wind, sun, and time. Lena dismounted. She walked slowly, fingers grazing the stone. "Hope Camille," she said, her voice barely above breath. "You weren't just a scream in the dark." Roy stood behind her, his hat over his heart. "She saved me," Lena whispered. "She took the pain meant for me. And still, I left her here, alone." "No," Roy said. "You survived her. That was never betrayal. That was the only fight you had left." Lena knelt, dug with her bare hands. Not deep, just enough to unearth a rusted locket still chained to the root of a bent willow. She opened it. Inside, a photograph. Faded beyond recognition, but she didn't need a face. She remembered the eyes, Hope's eyes, and beside the locket, wrapped in oilskin, another harmonica, older, cracked, but still whole. She brought it to her lips, played the same tune Roy used to hum without knowing why. The wind carried the notes down the valley like a secret set free. As they rode down from the hill, Lena stopped at a grove where a lone wagon wheel leaned against a tree. There, sitting cross-legged in the dust, was a woman. Becca, a survivor. Lines on her face spoke of years lived in silence, but when she saw Lena, she nodded, as if they'd been waiting for this meeting all their lives. "I buried her," Becca said, gesturing toward the hill. "We all thought you were dead." Lena sat beside her. "Sometimes I wished I was." Becca didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She handed Lena a small carved cross. "She made this the night before the fire, said you'd need something to hold if the sky ever fell again." Lena took it, pressed it to her chest. Roy stayed back, watching from a distance. And when Lena stood, her shoulders were straighter, her eyes no longer hunted. She turned to Roy. "I'm done running," she said. He nodded once. Then it's time to go home. Buzz she, but as they turned toward the horses, a sound rose from the trees, like gravel under boots. A figure, walking slow, confident, and wearing a coat too clean for someone meant to be dead. Clay Morrow. His eyes were dull, like a spent cartridge, but his smile still knew how to kill. "Well," he said, "ain't this just a goddamn resurrection?" Clay Morrow stood under the dying light like he belonged to the land, like some twisted part of it had let him grow back. His boots barely made a sound on the dry earth, but his presence shook the air like thunder without clouds. Roy stepped forward, shotgun still slung low but ready. He didn't blink, didn't speak. Clay's grin was wide, yellowed by whiskey and worse. "I see you've been raising ghosts," Roy called her. "Shame about the ranch." He looked toward Lena. "Sweet girl, did you really think Jude could keep a fire like you tamed?" Lena didn't move, didn't flinch. Becca whispered, "He's not supposed to be alive." Clay heard it. "Ah, Becca, still whispering like the shadows are listening, but you're right, I should be dead. They tried, burned my church, took my flock, but some roots grow deep even in ash." Roy's voice cracked the silence. "You're not a preacher anymore, Clay." Clay's eyes narrowed. "No, I'm something holier now. I am the Last Testament." He reached into his coat. Roy raised the shotgun. "Don't," he growled, but Clay didn't pull steel. He pulled out a book, leather-bound, faded. He opened it and held it out. "Names," he said. "Every child, every miracle born under our covenant. Lena's name is in here. So is Hope's. So is yours, Becca. You think survival makes you clean. You think remembering gives you power." He stepped closer to Lena. "I made you for something bigger than this horse shit freedom. You were my blood, the one meant to carry our fire." Lena looked at the book, then back at him, and said, quiet as bone dust, "You don't own what you broke." Clay laughed once. "You're gonna kill your own father?" Roy stepped forward. "She doesn't have to." He tossed Lena a key. She caught it without looking. "The cabin," Roy said. "In the canyon. The one no one but me knew." Lena nodded, understanding blooming like smoke in her chest. "The box. The one with the truth inside." As she ran, Clay turned to Roy. "Always playing the savior, huh? But you're empty, Roy. No bloodline, no wife, no purpose." Roy lowered the shotgun. "That's where you're wrong." And from his coat, he pulled something older than the both of them. A Colt Dragoon revolver, heavy, scarred, still deadly. It once belonged to his grandfather, fought with it in Fort Apache. Now Roy carried it for one last sermon. Clay drew. Roy fired first. Boom. The bullet hit Clay in the shoulder, but he didn't fall. He dropped the book, staggered, and charged. They collided, fists, bone. Clay's blade caught Roy across the ribs, shallow but mean. Roy headbutted him. Clay dropped the knife. Then Roy grabbed the book. "Blood has memory," Roy said, panting, "but so does fire." And he tossed it into the old chapel flame. Clay lunged after it, screaming, just as Roy kicked him into the embers. He writhed like a snake cut from its god. Lena returned, breathing hard, holding a satchel. In her hand, the harmonica. In the other, the cross carved by Hope. She watched Clay burn, didn't cry, didn't scream. Roy sank to his knees, the wound now bleeding freely. Lena rushed to him. "You'll be all right," she whispered. He looked up at her, smiled weakly. "You're free now." Then his eyes fluttered, and the wind carried the harmonica tune one last time. Roy didn't fall right away. He sat there, half upright, blood pooling beneath his ribs, hat tipped back just enough for the starlight to catch the lines on his face, the revolver still warm in his hand. Clay's body lay smoldering in the chapel ruins, smoke rising like a confession. Lena knelt beside him, hands pressed tight against the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You held on this long. You don't get to quit now." Roy smiled, slow and worn like an old saddle. Hell, I wasn't ever good at quitting. Ask my ex. She tried to smile, but it cracked into a sob. He touched her cheek with shaking fingers. Don't cry for me, Lena. You're not him, she said, voice breaking. You never were. I know, he said, barely audible now. But for a little while, it felt like I got to be something close. Lena reached into her satchel, pulled out the box from the canyon cabin, the one Roy had left behind years ago. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed, torn at the edges. She opened it, read silently. Roy, if you find this, it means you chose not to end things the way you planned. I pray for that every day. You were never broken, Roy. You were just waiting for someone worth giving your pieces to. If that person finds you, be softer than the man I married, and stronger than the man you used to be. And if they call you father, even once, answer like you've been one your whole life. Monsieur Lena looked at Roy. I found it, she whispered. I know, he breathed. His eyes began to lose focus. The wind picked up. I never had a daughter, he murmured, until I lost one. Then, nothing. No gasp. No twitch. Just stillness, like the land had taken him back. They buried Roy Calder under the tree behind the chapel, roots deep, soil warm from the fire. Lena carved his name with her own knife. Not fancy, not grand, just Roy Calder. He rode toward the smoke. Beside the grave, she placed the harmonica, and beside that, the Colt Dragoon, legacy in steel and song. Becca stayed silent, a hand on Lena's shoulder. Tommy Ray tied Roy's hat to the saddle horn of Silverjack. When Lena mounted, the dawn was starting to stretch across the hills. You ridin'? Tommy asked. She nodded. To Dry Willow first, then where the wind tells me. He smirked. Can I come? She shook her head gently. Not yet. Someone's got to stay and remember the names. Tommy looked down, kicked at the dirt, then saluted in the awkward way kids do when they're trying not to cry. Lena turned to Becca. Clay's book, it's gone, she said. Becca replied, Good. Now no one can tell your story but you. And with that, Lena rode, not with fury, not with fear, but with something Clay could never understand. Peace. The years passed without asking permission. Dry Willow changed like all small towns do when ghosts are finally buried. The saloon burned down, rebuilt into a feed store. Miss Thalia's old shop became a halfway house for widows, and the chapel, charred and broken, was left untouched, a monument to what the town chose to remember and what it chose to forget. But some names don't fade with paint or stone. They stay in the dust and in the wind. One morning, when the sky was still the color of cold milk and the birds hadn't yet begun their arguments, a rider came down the hill into Dry Willow. She wore a long duster, faded hat, eyes clear as glass and twice as sharp. Behind her, on a small chestnut pony, sat a girl. Red hair tangled by the wind, freckles kissed by the sun. No more than 7, maybe 8. Her name was June Calder, and she didn't know much about her mother's past, but she knew to stay quiet when the trees leaned in too close, and how to whistle a tune that made grown men stop and listen. Lena didn't speak as she dismounted. She tied her horse outside the old ranch, the one Roy had rebuilt with stubborn hands and a cracked back. It was empty now, but not hollow. The wood still smelled of leather oil. The porch still groaned like it remembered who once paced across it every sunrise. June walked beside her. Was this your home? She asked. No, Lena said. This was his. She stepped onto the porch and opened the door. The hinges still creaked like a prayer. Inside, everything was covered in a soft sheet of dust, except for one corner of the table where sunlight always hit. There sat a folded piece of paper. Lena opened it. Roy's handwriting, fading but firm. If you're reading this, it means you came back. Maybe not for me, but for something I left behind. I hope it wasn't pain. I hope it was peace." She folded the note carefully, tucked it into June's saddlebag, then walked out to the yard. There, half buried in weeds, was the old wooden sign Roy had carved long ago but never nailed to the gate. Lena dusted it off with her sleeve. "Burned into the wood. He didn't raise me. He freed me to raise myself." She smiled, not bitter, not broken, just full. June tugged her hand. "Is Grandpa in the ground?" Lena looked to the lone tree near the hill, the one that grew stronger after the fire. "No, baby," she said. "He's in the wind." And at that moment the wind rose, soft, warm, familiar. It whistled through the dry grass, rattled the old wind chime made from broken spurs, and somewhere in that sound, if one listened close, was the hum of a harmonica. She never called him father, but the wind did, and that was enough. If this story stirred something in you, maybe just one memory, one ache, or one hope, go ahead and drop a simple 1 in the comments. Sometimes just one number says, "I felt that too." And if you want more tales like this, of dust, redemption, and the quiet weight of love, don't forget to subscribe. There's always another story waiting beyond the next ridge. We'll ride again soon.